We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Putin is on the brink of Ukraine and Boris is in Scotland. Is the housing crisis crippling British startups? Are the polls tighter than we thought? Good morning, it's 9 o'clock and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio, 9:30. It is, of course. We have a show jam-packed with the biggest stories, the sharpest analysis, all that straight after these headlines.
Good morning, it is 9:31. I'm Rosie Wright here to keep up to date on GB News. Boris Johnson will make a last-ditch attempt to try to stop Russia invading Ukraine. Downing Street says Moscow could be planning to invade at any moment and say the aim of the Prime Minister's meetings is to bring the country back from the brink of war in Ukraine. The Prime Minister plans to hold talks with world leaders this week as the crisis enters a critical juncture. A public inquiry into the wrongful conviction of sub-postmasters and mistresses of theft, fraud and false accounting will begin today. Hundreds of former employees were falsely accused because of a flawed computer system the post office branches used called Horizon. Well, the inquiry is going to look at whether the post office knew about the IT issues and their handling of them. The UK and Scottish governments have agreed to establish green Freeport zones, which offer tax breaks, among other incentives for businesses. The new deal coincides with the Prime Minister's visit to Edinburgh today. A bidding process for the Freeports will open in spring, and it's hoped the new sites will open in 2023. Salaries for jobs in hospitality have increased by up to 12%. That's according to new research from Caterer.com. Chef positions are now offering pay of more than £50,000. And jobs for waiting staff and bartenders are also being advertised with higher wages. Unvaccinated teenagers can now travel to Spain as long as they have a negative PCR test. The country's reversed its policy that asked previously for UK visitors aged between 12 and 17 to be double jabbed. Well, the change coincides with the start of half-term, which for many in the UK begins today. A Russian figure skater who failed a drugs test at the Winter Olympics in Beijing is going to be able to continue to compete at the event. The 15-year-old Kamila Valieva would have been the youngest athlete to be banned for doping during the Olympic Games. But a court of arbitration says the sport for the teenager, in this case, it's an exceptional circumstance, and that no provisional suspension should be imposed. You're up to date here on GB News. We're on your TV, online and DAB Plus radio. I'll be keeping you up to date across the day. But now let's head to The Briefing with Tom Harwood.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now, today the Prime Minister will attempt to bring Russian President Vladimir Putin, quote, back from the brink of war. Downing Street says that Moscow could be planning to invade Ukraine at any moment, whilst US officials say an attack is likely in the next 48 hours. Western nations have threatened Moscow with an unprecedented package of sanctions in the event of a further Russian incursion into Eastern Europe. Well, let's get an overview of the latest now with Mark White, our home and security editor. Welcome to the programme, Mark. 48 hours seems incredibly fast, but the Ukrainians seem to disagree with the Americans.
Yes, I mean, I think the Americans are reaching this 48-hour conclusion as the analysis is telling them that the forces that are being massed by Vladimir Putin will be in a position to launch an invasion if that's what they want to do. Clearly, for weeks, months now, they have been getting into position with not just ground forces, but naval assets in Crimea, the Air Force as well. They say that the Americans, that is, that their intelligence tells them that by Wednesday they will have reached that point where they could do this. I don't think they're saying Wednesday it's going to happen, but it could happen by that day. Either way, I mean, it is of great concern, and we are in really a pivotal week where there are now intense efforts. So there's been quite a bit of diplomacy in recent weeks, as you know, but it's really been stepped up now this week with a view just to trying to bring Russia back from the brink. Of course, Russia, we should add, has maintained throughout that it has no intention of launching any kind of invasion, that this is all propaganda coming from the West.
We will be talking to someone on the ground in Russia a bit later in this programme, but just for now, let's have a few seconds on what the British are doing. The Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary, they've both been to Russia. We're hearing that Boris will try and talk to Putin later this week as well. What more is British foreign policy trying to do? Yeah,
you're right to point out the diplomacy. Last week was a key week for the UK. You had Liz Truss there. Didn't go all that well. I think her opposite number, Sergei Lavrov, that very experienced foreign minister in Russia, seemed to humiliate Liz Truss. It went better for Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, when he was there the next again day. The Prime Minister, of course, was in Poland, trying to reassure NATO allies that they have, of course, Britain's backing. There are more troops that are heading to the region, both Poland and Estonia, with an additional fleet of 6 Typhoon fighter aircraft going to the region as well. Naval assets are going into the Eastern Mediterranean, and also HMS Prince of Wales, our supercarrier, which is part of the NATO strike battle group at the moment. It's heading up off Norway. So a lot of assets heading up there to send this message that with the diplomacy is also an assertive UK that is more than willing to defend its NATO allies.
Supercarriers and battle groups. Well, Mark White, thank you for that overview there. As I say, we'll be getting the view from someone on the ground in Russia a little bit later in the programme. But Mark White there, our Home Affairs and Security Editor, on what is a pivotal week in British foreign policy. But now back to Westminster politics, for something very interesting happened over the weekend in the field of political polling. Now, polls, of course, have been hugely influential in how jumpy MPs have been, and consequently, how likely or otherwise they are to dethrone the Prime Minister. Well, on Saturday, pollsters Opinium, who accurately projected the 2019 general election and the EU referendum, have updated their methodology. Among other things, an updated approach to turnout weighting is being instituted, given the big number of Conservative voters switching from Conservative to don't know. Now, in the most recent poll, the first conducted with this new methodology, the Labour lead dropped from 10 points to just 3. As those watching on TV should be able to see here, Labour's share drops from 42 points to just 37 points, all because of this change in methodology. And now I know sometimes people distrust the polls, but they're generally pretty good. Those watching on TV now can see Opinium's final poll in the 2019 general election compared to the actual result, getting the Labour share, getting the Tory share, getting the Lib Dem share exactly right. Well, let's talk through this change in methodology now with the head of political polling at Opinium, Chris Curtis. Welcome to the programme, Chris. It's a pretty seismic thing to do, to change how you interpret the numbers that go into the polling machine and to reduce the the Labour lead from 10 to 3. Why did you do it?
I sort of have a pretty important principle in polling, which is you constantly need to update and reflect what's happening in modern Britain and make sure that you don't rest on your laurels, even if you have been accurate in the past. And as you showed there, our previous polling was quite accurate. Even when that is the case, you still need to be doing checks on your methodology, running updates, looking at ways that you can improve. And we've done a big review of our methodology over the last few months. We've looked at places where potentially we're underestimating certain parts of the population, overestimating other parts of the population, and we've made changes to adapt to those. So, for example, we're including more people from ethnic minority communities, we're including more people who don't pay much attention to politics, we're including more older people who don't have a graduate degree, because we think they're also increasingly important in deciding how people vote or people's voting behaviour in elections. But the other thing, as you mentioned, which is pretty unique situation right now, is there's a lot of people who voted Conservative at the last election who have moved to now saying that they don't know. And there's a really interesting question about in polling about how we treat those, particularly how we treat those in midterm polling at the moment. Now, the general consensus among pollsters is that they're probably being treated, the Conservatives are probably being treated a little bit too harshly in the headline voting intention figure because they're losing so many voters to don't know. So we've made some adaptations to our methodology, which has meant that the Conservative headline voting intention number isn't dragged down so much because of that fact.
So what we're seeing with pollsters up until now is that all of these Tory voters who haven't been excited by the Labour Party but who've switched to don't know, they've been, I suppose, over-interpreted in terms of thinking that they won't go back to the Tories at the time of the election. How does it work? How do you reinterpret what people switching from Conservative to don't know are actually going to do?
Yeah, I mean, our system is a little bit more complicated to explain, but very roughly speaking, what pollsters would normally do is those voters that have moved from Conservative to don't know, they just get dropped completely from the headline voting intention and are treated almost as if they just wouldn't vote in the general election, which we know isn't necessarily true. Our system, what we basically do is we take those people in the poll who say that they'll vote in an election, and we weight that section of people to be representative of those who we know will actually vote on election day. Now, obviously, if you've got lots of Conservative people who voted Conservative at the last election and you drop them, that means that the people that are left, there's not enough people who voted Conservative in the 2019 election in your sample of voters. In our case, we weight that to make sure we've got enough people in there who voted Conservative in the 2019
This is really interesting. This is really interesting because obviously these polls are having a huge effect on what Conservative MPs are doing, whether or not they're going to kick out the Prime Minister. In your view, will other pollsters start to update their weighting in the way that you've done? And could that across the board reduce the gap between the Labour and the Tory party?
I think the most important way that anybody should be interpreting opinion polls right now, regardless of where you're from, is that things are pretty bad for the Conservative Party. Even our sort of slightly more optimistic poll for them does show a pretty, Labour lead, and things are pretty bad for the Prime Minister. His personal approval ratings are bad. Now, maybe they were not as bad as we previously thought, and it's all going to come down to those Conservative undecided voters and where they end up going. But it's still not a particularly positive situation for the Conservative Party or for Boris Johnson at the moment.
Well, really, really interesting to talk through that there. Chris Curtis, thank you for joining us on the briefing this morning, of course, of Opinium, the pollsters there. Thank you for joining us. Now, the Entrepreneurs Network today have published a report about how the high cost of housing and how it's holding back British startups. Well, so far it's been backed, this report has been backed by 60 entrepreneurs who are calling on the government to prioritise new homes in their upcoming Levelling Up bill. Now, these entrepreneurs include Yo Sushi's Simon Woodcroft and the Entrepreneur First's Matt Clifford. Well, let's talk through what this report is, what it all means, with Aria Babu, who's researcher at the Entrepreneurs Network and head of the Female Founders Forum. Welcome to the programme, Aria. So, how does housing affect entrepreneurialism? I suppose when people think of startups, they might think of tech. They might think this is what you can do working from home. Perhaps we don't need people living closely together or new homes.
So a lot of companies can now don't have to be located in the same place, but the entrepreneurs that we've been speaking to say that the fact that it's really difficult now to hire staff in London, Oxford, Cambridge, where their businesses are based, is holding back their productivity. So some of them are choosing to switch to remote workers, and they're even hiring remote workers in as far away as like India or Brazil, where like employment is much cheaper. But when they can, they still want staff in London or Oxford or Cambridge or Bristol or Edinburgh, places with really expensive housing, and this is proving to be very difficult for them.
I see. So because we're not building enough homes, particularly in these innovative centres, these sort of cities with big research communities, firms are more likely to hire people abroad than British people.
This is true, yes. So if you can't have a staff member in London with you, then it makes really no difference if they're in Wales or if they're in like, India. So you might as well switch to hiring someone very far away if it's that much cheaper.
Now, some people might say that not building loads new housing down in the rich southeast might be positive for other parts of the country, maybe encouraging people to stay back in those left behind, forgotten communities. But there's a certain amount of research that shows actually that not building houses down in the southeast can hurt those left-behind communities.
It hurts them because innovation is basically the lifeblood of the economy. It is much easier to start a business in a dense cluster where there are other entrepreneurs, where there is other expertise, where people are meeting each other and coming up with ideas. So cities will always be the most productive places. If you price people out of them, you don't necessarily just move this economic activity to another part of the country, you kill it. So instead of having companies that are inventing like new ways of curing cancer or like making new like meat products or something, they just don't exist.
So why is it that all of the sort of big firms of the world, they seem to be based in California? That we don't have a British Apple or a British Google or a British Amazon. If we were to really fix our housing problem, might the next tech superpower company come from Britain?
I think it plausibly could. Silicon Valley has created more unicorns than the entirety of Europe. There is definitely something to having a cluster of really, really bright people, but Silicon Valley has failed to solve their own housing problem. It's one of the most expensive places in the world to live. And over the course of the past 5 years, entrepreneurs have been fleeing there, like tech workers have been fleeing there. They've been moving to places like Miami or Texas. We could capture that. We could encourage these people to move to the UK. The UK has really great fundamentals. We've got some of the best universities in the world. We have DeepMind. We have loads of interesting tech companies. So we could steal the best and the brightest from California and bring them to the UK.
That's so interesting because the competitive environment now, particularly with those sort of Republican-controlled states of Texas and of Florida, sort of stealing those people, we should get in on that game, is what you're saying.
We definitely should. And if we don't, Paris, Amsterdam or Frankfurt will do it instead. And these are much cheaper places to live. In Berlin, your rent is about half what it is in London.
Wow, well, it's a significant problem, but also a significant opportunity there. Aria Babu of the Entrepreneurs Network, thank you very much for talking us through that new paper there, Build Houses, Create Entrepreneurs. Now, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is on the first stop of his Levelling Up tour of the UK, which he'll see him in the northwest later this week. Well, today, he's pledged to boost trade and business in Scotland by creating 2 green free ports north of the border. Now, free ports are sort of tax-free zones around docks, airports or railway hubs designed to boost economic growth by exempting goods arriving in them from tax and customs charges. It sounds technical, but it does boost growth. Now, James Bundy is a political commentator at the Freedom Declared Foundation, and he joins me now. James, in England and in Wales, we're getting free ports, but in Scotland, we're calling them green free ports. Is there any practical difference?
I don't think there is. I think it's an emphasis just on the net zero element of the free ports. In Scotland, we do have an SNP Green Coalition, so the environment is at the forefront of political thinking in Scotland. So this is clever branding by the Prime Minister and the UK government, but it's also going to bring economic benefits to these towns in Scotland that get the free ports. This was a Brexit promise, and the Prime Minister and the UK government is about to deliver it.
Now, the SNP has been pretty wary of pointing to Brexit successes. Is this a potential amelioration of the hostility between the Scottish Government and the UK Government, the fact that they could be working together now for the benefit of Scotland, the creation of these 2 new ports?
I would hope so, because jobs, economic boost should be something that both governments celebrate. But the priority of the SNP government is to cause division, stoke up grievance to try and boost their independence agenda. So anything that brings jobs, prosperity, the SNP will try and find a way to blame this as something that the Union is imposing on Scotland against Scotland's will. We know this is a lot of rubbish. This was a Brexit promise. It's going to deliver jobs, and the UK government is doing that. This is good news for Scotland and something that all of Scotland should be celebrating.
Some people might say that free ports might well bring jobs, but ultimately all they're doing is cutting regulation and cutting taxes, and that's going to reduce potentially tax receipts for the government. That might reduce standards as well. Is that a valid argument?
I think there's a spillover effect. So if there's economic prosperity in towns, then this spreads out. And if that spreads out, then tax receipts go up overall. So I think it's a short-sighted approach. I think we need to see how these free ports will benefit the whole economy. And yeah, the evidence with the economic boost and spillover shows that over time, tax receipts will increase.
Finally, Boris Johnson, of course, is seen as a bit of a divisive figure in Scotland. Is it a brave move for him to visit Scotland today to promote this new venture?
It is brave. I think if you're unpopular, you don't win people over by hiding. You win people over by engaging with them. And that's what the Prime Minister is doing in Scotland today. And he has a very positive message to sell in terms of achievements by the UK government. The furlough scheme during the pandemic was world leading. The vaccination procurement by the UK government was world leading. And the levelling up agenda is something that will see the UK government directly investing in communities throughout Scotland for the first time since 1997. So my hometown of Falkirk, we're getting £20 million direct investment from the UK government to build a magic roundabout. It might seem small, but this is going to improve the daily lives of people in my hometown. And the UK government is doing this throughout Scotland. So this is very positive to sell, and the Prime Minister should be up here selling it.
It's interesting. There seems to be this twin-pronged approach of the levelling up agenda. On the one hand, tax cuts in places like free ports that will boost growth, but on the other hand, a bit of a redistributive agenda, potentially a more left-wing agenda of investing in communities directly. It will be interesting to see how that all plays out. Of course, Scotland, the first stop on that levelling up tour that will go across the rest of the UK throughout this week. James Bundy there, thank you very much for joining us, political commentator. Of course. Really interesting to see that levelling up tour kicking off. Will it sink in? Who knows? Well, let's turn our focus back to Ukraine and the warning that an imminent invasion by Russia is becoming more likely. Now, Jacoblassen is a postdoctoral research scholar at the Meliken Centre for Russian, East Asian and Eastern European Studies and joins me now from Russia. Welcome to the programme. First of all, let's get what the feeling is in Russia about this. Russia, of course, have been denying that they are going to be invading, incursing upon Ukraine. But, of course, more than 100,000 troops around the border. What's going on?
Well, at least from the Russians that I've spoken to and what I've seen on the news here, it's not the main story. It's not the way that it is in the West, where we're focusing in on it every single day, every hour. Here in Russia, people are much more concerned with Kamila Valieva, the figure skater, being reinstated to the Olympics, much more worried about issues related to the economy. It hasn't been the number one story here.
That's really fascinating because, of course, in America and Britain particularly, and continental Europe to some extent, this has been the number one foreign policy issue, to some extent the number one story. Is this just Mr. Putin trying to create chaos, sow division, spread mistrust and get people thinking different things to promote his agenda through the chaos?
I think that's definitely a major aspect of it. I can't, presume to say what Putin is thinking, but what he's been able to accomplish with this is to get Russian security concerns back onto the world agenda. He's gotten world leaders to come to him, quite literally coming to Moscow to speak with him. He's gotten, this to become such a major issue that, again, we're readdressing the idea of NATO expansion. And, for years, decades almost, this hasn't been talked about at such high levels. So Putin has been able to accomplish that regardless of whether or not he ends up invading.
So are we being played then? Is the West being played like a fiddle by Mr. Putin? As you rightly say, world leaders from presidents, prime ministers, chancellors, foreign secretaries, defence secretaries, all descending upon Moscow. People talking about ending the expansion of NATO, as if NATO was some kind of expansionary power, not a defensive alliance that people can choose to join. I wonder, is Putin winning, even if he doesn't invade Ukraine?
Well, I do think that regardless of what happens going forward, he's definitely won a lot of the narrative battle, and he's gotten a lot of just airtime and concession in the sense that people have had to address these issues. That he's been able to kind of divide the NATO members so that we get different responses at times between France and Germany, the UK and the US. So he's definitely been able to manipulate things and get things going in that direction that he wants to. I think the most important thing going forward is for us to listen to what the Ukrainians are saying. They're the ones who obviously have the most stake in this. They're the ones who know the situation best. And as President Zelensky has been saying, panic doesn't help anyone except for Putin. Countries pulling their people out of embassies, companies stopping their flights to Ukraine is only going to isolate the country and strengthen Putin's hand. So that's really a worry that I think we should really be focusing on.
Well, it will be a fascinating week to follow. Of course, 48 hours is the warning we're hearing from the Americans, potentially when the Russians may be ready for an invasion. We'll follow this very closely. But for now, Jacoblassen, postdoctoral research fellow at the Melikin Center for Russian, Eurasian and Eastern European Studies, thank you for joining us on the briefing this morning. Well, that's it for the programme. Coming up is To The Point with Nana Akua and Mercy Moroki. But first, it's the weather.
We're looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking cloudy and breezy for many, with outbreaks of showery rain pushing south and eastwards. Let's take a look at the details.
In the southwest, there'll be some showers around lunchtime. Some of those will be quite heavy, highs of around 9 Celsius, feeling chillier with a brisk wind.
In the southeast, it should be drier. Across Kent and far southeast, there should still be some sunshine, but around London, it will be mostly cloudy.
Plenty of showers across much of Wales as we head into the afternoon. Some breaks in the cloud, but